Today we have a crazy revenge story of getting an old boss fired. We'll get into that in a bit, but first, my neighbor liked to clean. 2001, I just moved to a quiet neighborhood where my children, 1 and 3, could play outside safely and grow up with neighborhood children. It was also nice for my cats, 3, to finally be able to run around outside. After the first week, it was our first garbage day. Everything neatly in closed bags and in our personal garbage container. In the morning, we had to place the container on the side of the road with the rest of the containers on our street. So it was there at 7 o'clock, after which I started cleaning my house. I had a white floor because I liked it, and that way I knew for sure that it was clean. I mopped daily. I was still extremely clean at that time because of crawling children. Then I did the shopping, and when I got home, I was in shock after opening my front door. My entire hall was full of unknown waste. Pieces of glass, sharp metal lids, pieces of food, cartons, plastics, etc. Clearly stuffed through the mail slot. I already saw a number of neighbors looking at me expectantly behind their windows and in front of their house. It was clear that they knew more. After asking around, I was told who had thrown that garbage in my house. Conscious neighbor had done this with much fanfare. Something snapped inside me. A bomb in my frontal lobe and all decency disappeared from my mind. Steam from my ears. I cleaned out the trash and put the kids in the living room. Then I cleaned the cat litter box. Normally I throw the entire contents in a bag, but now I was a bit more precise. I only scooped the poop and urine clumps out of the box and divided it evenly into 2 small bags. Those thin ones that tear quickly. I took the bags and went to the neighbor further down the street. I rang the doorbell and kept the bags behind me. The lady opened the door with a smug grin on her face. The door opened wide and I could quickly see her hall. On the right, a carpeted staircase. On the left, the open door to the living room. The hall continued for another 1.5 meters to the back after the stairs and door where the toilet was. Everything was super clean. I asked her devilishly calm if she had put that waste through my mail slot. Her answer was yes, followed by the reasoning that because I was new here, that the loose waste that was lying around the placed containers must have been mine because before we lived here, that never happened. This was the moment that all the blood vessels in my eyes burst. The calm was gone. In a tirade of abuse, I made it clear to her that I'd not been the polluter and that if she had any decency, she could have spoken to me instead of jumping to conclusions and dirtying my house and endangering my crawling children and animals by dumping that waste in my house like that. With a message that she liked to clean up so much, "Here please," and I threw the 2 bags in her hallway, one against the corner of the stairs and the other on the doorpost of the living room. Everything, really everything was covered in poop and the splattered clumps of cat urine, with a warning/promise that if she ever thought of doing something like that again, I would smash all her windows. I turned around and went home. Everyone had seen and heard everything. Never heard anything from that neighbor again. No one ever thought of doing something like that to me again. I can still enjoy the face she pulled when she saw the bags flying. It was shock, fear, indignation, nausea, and despair all at once. I just gotta say, OP must be a very intimidating individual because even with the actions that they did and the threats that they made, I feel like you still have to reach some threshold of intimidation for them not to have tried to retaliate, even if it's just like calling the cops. Like for them to accept that OP just threw those bags of cat feces and urine all over their house and just take it on the chin like that, OP must be pretty scary when they're upset. Also, hi, I'm Steven, and if you guys enjoy crazy stories of revenge, it would be amazing if you left a like or left a review if you're listening to my podcast. That said, our next story is Hell Hath No Fury Like 2 Women Scorned, Say Goodbye to All Your Stuff. 15 years ago, I had a boyfriend that I'd been with for 6 years. He moved to another city for work while I finished my studies, and then I would move there too. He was apartment hunting, subleasing in the meantime. He came home almost every weekend and during Christmas and New Year's. He found an apartment in January and invited me up to show it, and I prepared to move up, looking for a job, looking for new furniture, etc. Late February, I told him it's time to terminate the lease on the apartment in our hometown, when he suddenly broke up with me. I was shocked and very sad. He collected some clothes and his very expensive PC, which he'd built from scratch. It was his baby. 2 weeks later, he updated his profile pic on Facebook to him and another woman kissing. Obviously, they hadn't been dating 2 weeks. I called him and called him out on it, and he admitted to having met her 2 months ago. He was at the airport to travel abroad with his buddy for the weekend, so we didn't talk long. That same evening, I decided to tell the new girlfriend. I managed to find her on Facebook and wrote her. She didn't believe me at first, of course, but I sent her texts, pics. I described their apartment in detail. Well, her apartment, as it turned out. When I sent her a you-know-what pic he'd sent me with their bedroom clearly in the background, she said, "Okay, enough. I believe you." She told me that they'd been dating for 8 months, not 2. She'd been in Africa for 2 months, in December and January, which would explain why he was able to be with me for 2 weeks over the holidays, and why he could invite me to see the apartment. We wrote a lot. He'd sent us the same Valentine's Day text. He'd bought us the exact same Christmas present, etc. You get the picture. After comparing notes, it was time for revenge. She cut up all of his clothes and left them in a pile on the floor. I told her about the PC and advised her to tear that freaker to pieces. She hacked it with screwdrivers and hammers, and every piece was beyond saving. When he came home on Sunday, she tossed him out with nowhere to go, but not before showing him all of his possessions obliterated. Edit: I need to clarify that legally, it was my PC. I'd won money on one of those scratch lottery tickets, but since we were living together, I kind of thought of it as ours. Huge mistake. As somebody that has a shameless amount of money invested in their personal PC setup, let's just say this story has continued to inspire me to strive to be a better person every single day. Like seriously, some people have like a car fixer-upper project. I have the PC. Our next story is, I stole my brother's credit card after he refused to pay for our trip. Ever since I was a child, we had this tradition of taking trips during the holidays. It wasn't a yearly thing, it was more like a once in 2 years or whenever my dad or mom could afford to take us somewhere different. We mostly booked hotels and treated ourselves to something nice while engaging in the different activities planned for us. We never left the country and it wasn't a problem. I mean, I was always so excited just to be somewhere that wasn't home. And somehow, we managed to keep the tradition going for a while, till my dad lost his job and things got tough. It was a lot on my mom, having to take care of 4 kids, and as the first child, I certainly had to grow up early. My dad was a mess. He got so depressed, he had a stroke. My mom worked endlessly and I was in charge of taking care of my siblings. I felt like I did the best I could to some extent. I just never understood why my mom always felt like she couldn't say no to my siblings. I later came to understand that it was because she didn't want my siblings to feel like they had lost their father, but it was a lot on her. They ought to have known that she could not afford to be both the mom and the dad. Growing up, this made them so comfortable asking for the strangest things from our mom. Although as time went on, my sisters outgrew that phase. My younger brother never did. He is always reluctant to pay for things in the family because he believes mom would take care of it. I hate how sneaky he gets whenever any matter regarding money arises. It pisses me off. The first time an incident occurred regarding us paying was when he wanted to throw a retirement party for my mom after working for a condiment company for 35 years. My sisters and I agreed to surprise my mom at home by inviting her friends and coworkers, and to do this, we all agreed to drop a specific amount of money. But then 4 days to the retirement party, my younger brother was unable to pay up his share because he was investing in something big and would only be able to have access to his money when he gets his returns. No one offered to lend him the money, so I chose to be the bigger person but never got my money back. I never even heard from him till 6 months later when it was his turn to pay for our dad's nursing bill. My dad had a private nurse who took care of him, and as grown adults, we all agreed to take rounds paying monthly, so each person has to pay 3 times in a year. This time, he'd been duped by an ex-girlfriend who stole all of his money, so he was penniless and had been surviving with the help of my mom since we went back home, so he couldn't afford to pay. I knew none of my sisters would ever agree to pay for Andrew's bill because to them, he was a lost cause. But I also knew that would mean my mom would be responsible for paying for our dad's nurse, but she had her hands full already taking care of my brat of a brother, so I paid. I expected this to be a one-time thing because we each took turns to pay for my dad's treatment and Andrew would be paying in the next 4 months, ultimately 3 times in a year, but somehow his share of the payment became mine, and even when he found his footing and left home, he never once took it up as his responsibility. I didn't have the energy to argue because of money for my dad's treatment, so I let that be. There's always something going on in my younger brother's life, and I've tried to be understanding to so many of his plights, it's slowly becoming a burden to me. When one of my sisters insisted we bring back the tradition of going on vacation during Thanksgiving, I knew who would mess that up, so I said no immediately. This came as a shock to my sisters and my mom because I never just turned down ideas, especially the ones involving activities with families, but then they began assuming it was because my job took me to different places, so it wasn't such a big deal to me. I work as a flight attendant. I suggested we cast a vote on the matter, and to my greatest surprise, my brother was the first to vote yes. I couldn't believe it. This was back in 2019, and I was the one still paying his share of my dad's medical bill, so hearing him agree to an event involving money felt like a huge step for me. I knew I wasn't going to try and push the medical bills back on him, since it wasn't such a hassle for me, but I expected him to at least pretend like he was grateful for what I'd been doing in the first place. He never did that. He would rather pretend like he had no idea I'd been helping him out than admit to being grateful for it because he was scared the responsibility would fall back on his shoulders. I eventually gave in since my younger brother was on board. I insisted we start with my brother just to see how serious he was. We were supposed to take our first trip outside the country, but then COVID happened and somehow my brother felt like he wasn't supposed to pay for the next trip since our first plan fell through. I told him that wasn't how it worked. He never paid for anything yet, so he had no right to exclude himself. Then it caused an argument and everyone felt it was best we settled it by me being the starter since I was the firstborn. Eventually, Andrew would get his turn and have no choice but to pay. So I began the cycle, and honestly, it didn't come cheap. I was doing pretty well as a flight attendant. I made enough to cover the cost, but it was still a strain on me to cover the cost of 5 people. We chose Morocco as the first place for the trip, and I was also responsible for other expenses during the trip. Although my mom was kind enough to help out with some things, she felt like we should have arranged ourselves in pairs so the payment wasn't too much on one person. It was nice to spend a week in another city, taking in the nice view and seeing my mom so carefree. After this, we all returned to our normal lives. About 3 months later, I was assigned to an interstate flight. My brother worked in LA while I lived in New York City. It felt like an opportunity to see where he lived and worked, so I called to let him know I was in his city and would like to meet up. He didn't sound thrilled on the phone. I thought he was busy, so I told him I didn't mind waiting, but he said it was fine. I should stay put where I was. He was coming to meet me. I expected some level of enthusiasm from him, but he wasn't looking like he wanted to see me. When I asked about work, he just shrugged and said it was fine. I told him I was looking forward to seeing his place of work, and he immediately cut me off, saying that they were remodeling, so that wouldn't be possible. When I asked if he could take me to his apartment, he came up with another excuse. He was being sneaky about a lot of things. When we were about leaving, he bumped into a guy who was shocked to see my brother. He immediately asked him if he was still working at a particular company that sounded familiar but I couldn't place, and my brother dragged his friend to a corner before answering him. We both said our goodbyes and I left for New York. I kept trying to recall where I heard the name of the company my brother's friend mentioned, then it clicked. It was one of those companies famous for their gaming platform. I was shocked. I mean, my brother and I didn't talk about his work much, but all he told us was that he worked for a company. At that moment, I knew something wasn't adding up if my brother was working at such a place. It meant he was getting paid well unless he had a low-ranking job. Now I was curious, so I called Annabelle, my immediate sister, to ask what she knew about Andrew's job, and she was clueless about what he did. Denise, on the other hand, knew he worked as a programmer for a gaming company, but she didn't know the name of the company. Things were getting clearer to me. Either my younger brother had loads of debt to pay off, or he was just smooching off me. I couldn't believe it. I'd never gotten a dime from that boy, yet he was busy giving me responsibilities he could easily handle. I called my brother immediately to let him know he was back to paying my dad's nurse, and without waiting to hear whatever messed up excuse he had, I cut off the phone. My brother tried to be stubborn, but eventually he started paying his dues when we all attacked him. The next year, 2022, Annabelle paid for our trip to South Africa. She and Denise split the bill into two halves, so it was easier on her, and they did the same when it was Denise's turn. They were closer to each other than I was with them, and they made their plan work. We had such a great time at South Africa. The year after, the next year, it was Italy. It was also fun. We ate a lot, were shown around to different places. This year, we decided to go to Mexico. My brother was the one to pay this time, only this time he had a busy schedule and wouldn't be able to join us. We told him it was cool and we could go without him, despite my mom's reservations. I told him to send the money for the trip, and he as usual told me to lend him, and he would pay me back when we were back from our trip. I knew my brother would have something to say as an excuse, so I told him I'd also invested all my money and was waiting for my returns. I am sure he wasn't expecting this, but he had no choice but to be cool with my excuse. I knew he had gotten to my mom when she said she was going to be paying for our trip. I told her there was no way in heck that was going to happen. I made my way to LA and tracked down my brother's apartment to see if he was living the dream. His apartment was worth my salary for a year, and he looked stunned to see me at his front door. I told him time was up and he was going to pay for our trip, and whether or not he was interested in tagging along was up to him, because he didn't look busy to me. At first, he tried to play the victim, but when he saw I wasn't buying his act, he fessed up and confessed that he was saving towards getting a Lamborghini, and he couldn't afford to pay for any trip right now. I don't know what made me more upset, the fact that he said that with a straight face, or the fact that he expected me to understand where he was coming from. We fought for hours, and when I saw I wasn't getting anywhere, I pretended like I needed to use the restroom and went for my brother's credit card, and my god, it felt so good to find it inside his drawer. It felt even better to finally get his password after several attempts, and I felt so happy with myself when I paid for all of our tickets with his credit card. I decided to withdraw some cash to change when we got to Mexico, and I knew he would deactivate his account as soon as he found out someone was spending his money, so I withdrew a lot of cash, which I got to change and spend. It felt so nice to see my brother's face when we got back from the trip. He had no idea I was the one who took his card. He was suspecting his girlfriend since the last one duped him. I wonder how selfish he must have been to be duped like that. In the long run, I enjoyed my vacation, and that is all that mattered. I'm just curious why they keep even trying to have like a relationship with this guy. Like, I feel like it seems pretty clear they don't actually have any interest in trying to maintain any real relationship with their family. They'd rather stay in their own well-off bubble and try to save up for a Lamborghini than involve themselves in a family vacation. That said, our next story is, old boss sabotaged my new job, so I got him fired. I see no reason why my old boss would go as far as sabotaging me in my new job when all I've ever been is a loyal and hardworking staff to him. What aggravates me even more is how some of my friends seem to think I went too far after explaining the whole ordeal to them, but I beg to differ because I lost my chance at getting a better job, and it was his fault. So I worked as an assistant for my old boss, Ian, for 5 years. It wasn't my dream job, but it paid the bills and it was better than nothing, so I stuck around. I never planned to be an assistant, but somehow I got the job after months of being an intern at the company I did my internship at. At the time, I felt so excited to be one of the few chosen among the interns that did their internship at the company. I didn't care about the position I was going to be given and had little knowledge on how a company ran. But I had hopes of one day getting promoted, and this was one of the discussions I had with my boss a few months into working for him, where he stated that I was going to be promoted a few months later after being an assistant. But it turns out I was a little too good at my job, so he gave me a raise instead of getting promoted. The deal seemed fair, and according to my boss, I was getting paid twice the amount my colleagues were being paid. I was so excited to finally earn real money rather than the pennies I'd been getting, I forgot to make inquiries from other staff. A year and a half down the line, we had an office party where I found out I was being paid the least amount, and other assistants were earning twice as much. The position I had in mind to attain was certainly getting paid twice the amount I was earning, and what I was told by my boss was the opposite. I knew I'd been played by my boss, and the chances of me getting the position I wanted was slim to none, so I decided to make inquiries from the other staff. Most of them understood where I was coming from, but they all had the same advice. If I wanted to get a more suitable position, it was better to apply elsewhere. Working with a boss like mine, I had to be careful and cautious about every move I made because he was quick to notice any slight change or difference, so I made sure my applications weren't affecting my job. There were days when I had doubts about what I was doing, but then I think about the bigger picture and how it was my future that was at stake, not my boss. How I didn't want time to pass me by and get stuck working as an assistant 10 years down the line, so I took every opportunity that came my way seriously and began applying to a different company. The bright side was that I had the connections because I knew a lot of coworkers at the office, so I could easily request for help from them and they offered me help. People knew people, and they were willing to refer me and offers came in, but I knew not every offer was a good one, so I made sure I was very careful and wise with my decision. Some I had to refuse because of the distance, some because of the position available, and others because of the pay. I made sure I never settled for less like I did at my first job, and after a while, I was able to get the perfect offer. The pay was reasonable and distance wasn't a barrier. I knew an opportunity like this only comes once in a lifetime, so I decided to jump at it. I had an interview with the boss, who was very comfortable to talk to, and a week later I was given a call by the other company that I'd been hired. While this was something I'd always wanted and was thrilled at the prospect of doing something new and different, I had to hand in my resignation letter to my boss Ian, and a part of me felt sad about that. But I had to think about my future. I felt it was best to have a one-on-one conversation with my boss rather than writing a letter. It felt more respectful to me and I really thought he was going to be cool about it, but things didn't go as expected. I really tried to be subtle and calm while explaining myself to my boss, but he said I had no right to quit without prior notice and I should have given him heads up before applying for another job. He also talked about how I had no right to quit my job except if I was fired personally by him, how he made me who I was and had no right to go behind his back and look for a job. He made a scene. What I thought was going to be a simple communication turned out to be my boss showcasing his authority over me. I wasn't just going to stand still and listen to him make fun of y'all. All his accusations felt so insulting, so I knew I had to take it up with HR, and that was what I did. My boss and I had no contract stating I was to work for him for a particular amount of years, so there was nothing stopping me from leaving. A week and some days after leaving my old job, I got a call from my boss Ian asking to meet. He apologized over the phone for his wrong behavior and said we should meet. I saw nothing wrong with that and met with him, and he apologized once again. He said he felt bad for most of the things he said. He was just having a hard time coming to terms with the fact that I was quitting and he had no right to make a scene. He gave me a certain sum of money as a gift personally from him for all my hard work and said I was always welcome if I needed anything. We ended our conversation on a good note. Everything was fine. I was making plans on starting my new job the next week when I got a message from my new boss telling me to bring in a good letter of recommendation from an old boss or something just as something that could be added to my file to give me an edge for promotion in the future. It didn't sound bad and my old boss and I were on talking terms, so I thought to myself, why not? I spoke to Ian about it and he was more than happy to write one for me. He said things like that were best done through the mail instead of handwritten letters, and I agreed with him on that. I told him to just send the letter to me through my mail, and I would send it to my boss. But he said I didn't need to go through all that hassle. It would be more efficient if he sent it directly. It seemed more authentic if he sent it personally, and I wouldn't be accused of forging a letter of recommendation. It made sense when he said it. I dumbly gave him my boss's email address and believed the man I worked for over 5 years wouldn't betray me. I was looking forward to starting my new job. I got up early Monday morning and I'm pretty sure I was the first one to arrive at the building. I was that excited. What I wasn't expecting was my new boss calling me into the office to tell me my services would no longer be needed as the position had been given to someone else, and he'd made a mistake thinking it was me. I knew something wasn't adding up. There was no way a huge company like that would make such a mistake and have no idea that they hired 2 people for the same position. I asked if there was any other position available, and he said my services weren't needed at this company. He had a much more different tone from the first time we spoke, and I knew something else was going on. Instinctively, I knew it had to do with the email my old boss had sent, and I'd been sabotaged. I didn't want to believe it, especially because I didn't think my old boss would go that far. I had to be sure, because the mail I got from Ian was different. He sent me a copy of the letter he'd written and asked me if it was good enough, and what I saw looked good. But I knew he must have sent a different letter to the company from the one he sent to me. I had an old colleague of mine look through my old boss's computer to check the mails he sent, and sure enough, what he sent out to the company I got a job at was much more different. He really wrote a lot of awful things about me and recommended someone else for the job. He said I'd been fired for lack of competence and had no business working under someone. He said I couldn't handle the basic tasks he had given me, and I would definitely not be able to deal with much more intense work. He really outdid himself, and what was worse was that he recommended someone else for the job. I gave my old boss a call the next day asking to meet with him, and he of course came with his pretentious act, saying he heard from my old colleagues at work I didn't get the job. Then he went further to tell me my old job was still available if I wanted it, and I was always welcome back to the company. He must have seen me as a fool who would come crawling back at his feet for my old job, which was what he wanted. I knew he'd hired someone new, so his intention was to humiliate me. So I told him that would not be necessary, and he looked stunned. He definitely didn't expect that. I pretended not to have known he was responsible for sabotaging me, and him asking me to come back to my old job when he'd hired someone else just gave me the answer I was looking for. One of the perks of being an assistant for someone like Ian was that I knew his every move and deals. I knew many of his dirty secrets and just how to bring him down. If I was going to be jobless, he might as well be out of a job too. I knew particularly of a past deal he had with a client where he got them to sign with another company instead of ours because the other company had paid him more to make sure the client didn't sign a deal with our company. I also knew a few other secret deals he had which I turned a blind eye to, and I knew just how to get him. I went to speak to each of the stakeholders of the company, telling them different things Ian did, and making sure they gave each client a call to confirm it was indeed true. The clients had no reason to lie because it wasn't their butt on the line, it was Ian's, and they had no special relationship with him other than business. I made sure I was available when the meeting was done to address the issue with Ian present, and I didn't leave anything out when I was called out to state all his dirty deals. He was fired and replaced with someone new while I got the job I wanted. Ian and I never saw or spoke to each other again after getting fired. Last I heard, he traveled out of the country with his family, probably because he couldn't bear to face the shame of what he did. I like that OP at the very end says, oh, they probably moved out of the country due to shame. Does anybody else agree with my theory that